To the self-imposed burdens of martyrdom, suffering, and sacrifice, we shall now add original sin, with which we are all born, according to Christians.
The greatest difficulty for Catholics and many other Christians is original sin. Original sin does not appear in the New or Old Testaments as an expression, and the concept was inferred from St. Paul the Apostle in his letter to the Romans, in which he writes, "Through one man sin entered the world." He was referring to Adam. This central doctrine was propounded by St. Augustine of Hippo, where he was bishop, from 395 to his death in 430, and he was one of the founders of Roman theology. Hippo was near the modern Algerian coastal town of Annaba. As a young man, Augustine lived with a woman, not his wife, for 15 years and fathered a son. He came under the influence of St. Ambrose, Bishop of Milan, was converted to Christianity, educated, and returned to North Africa, where he lived in a community with friends. His most famous phrase, known to many people outside the small theological fraternity, is, "Lord, make me chaste, but not just yet." He left behind a large body of work, principally the Confessions, City of God, and the Meaning of the Trinity. He studied rhetoric, the art of public speaking, and became a teacher in Italy. He studied the Greek philosophers, especially Plato, later Mani, and very nearly became a religious skeptic. We shall come to Mani later. Despite, or perhaps because of, his agreeable younger days, original sin for him was not only the sin committed by Adam in picking and tasting the apple from the tree of life, resulting in his and Eve's fall and their expulsion from Eden. Adam's sin was hereditary, and all mankind was damned, except for the salvation offered by Christ through his church, in Rome, of course. Augustine also held that the sexual act was a sin if performed between man and wife when the object was not procreation, because then it was an act of carnal desire, known to theologians as concupiscence. The Church has sidestepped this injunction, but it continues to inform Roman Catholicism and many other Christian denominations in its formal attitude that sex for pleasure is wrong, even in marriage, although coitus interruptus, of the man withdrawing before orgasm, a form of contraception, is one of those compromises for which the Church is famous. Augustine's thinking, and that of his much later coadjutor, St. Anselm, Archbishop of Canterbury, remains the bedrock of the Church's attitude to contraception, abortion, divorce, sexual alternatives such as civil partnership between same-sex individuals, casual sex of any sort, and married priests and nuns. St. Augustine also wrote about predestination, the theory that one's place in the afterlife is preordained. Consequently, it did not matter what you did in life. Whether you went to heaven or to hell was a matter of grace. Good works did not come into it. The doctrine originates in the revelation of St. John the Divine, the last book of the New Testament, which asserts that there will only be 144,000 elected when Christ comes at the last judgment. The Church has completely rejected predestination because the Bible, particularly the New Testament, is thick with rewards for believers, especially those who suffer for their belief, those who see the error of their ways, and those who do good works. Promotion of predestination as a central tenet of Christianity would very probably have led to chaos, because salvation would have been no more than a lottery in which God had already picked the winning numbers. Also, in an age already made dangerous by the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, which happened in Augustine of Hippo's lifetime, Why add to difficulties by espousing predestination, which seemed to suggest that you could do just as you liked on earth because your behavior made no difference to what happened to your soul after death? It's perhaps easy to see why an intellect as great as St. Augustine's must have wrestled with predestination, for God has to be omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent. He must know what you are going to do before you've even thought of doing it. If earthly life were mapped out in such a way, God's judgment of whether you went to heaven or to hell was utterly unfair. It also negated the idea that Christ had come to earth to die for our sins, if, by following him, all but a few of us would never be redeemed. It would make redemption a lie. So what of free will? God is omniscient. The idea was taken up again by the philosophers in the 18th century and called determinism. Being part of the universe which exists for rational reasons, moral choice is also determined from the beginning because mankind cannot act outside the physical laws by which the universe exists, and human beings are part. The present state of the universe is exactly the same as its state in the past as in the future. Consequently, everything is knowable, including human behavior. It makes my head sore just thinking about this. It must have taxed even a mind as great as St. Augustine's. Perhaps to him, it was what we can describe as a paradox, an insoluble contradiction, a Greek word from classical times. The only thing you can do is to set it down as an ineffable mystery, as all religions do with things that are unfathomable. Many believers, I think, expect that all their questions will be answered after death. This is a very comforting option, I am sure. Insofar as religion and science may differ from each other on the question, what was there before the beginning, or the Big Bang to a scientist, neither may ever be explained, except that some scientists predict that eventually all things will be explicable in the here and now. You can already theorize that before Big Bang or God, there was no time, therefore there was nothing. Perhaps faith and science are not so far apart. I am no theologian, as any theologian will discern. I've tried to make a thumbnail sketch of what I think the saint was delving into in his works, though for the record, he hardly imagined the Big Bang. But he also wrote much about charity, care for the sick and the poor, and practiced selflessly himself these things. His was a brilliant, well-stocked mind, whose philosophy is profound but very difficult, as you can sense. It would take St. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century to resolve this difficulty for Catholics. In our review of the very late antique world so far, individual suffering and self-denial dominate Christianity. The great unwashed, the people, were subjected to a life little better than slavery by their betters, and this could be seen as divinely appointed. Food shortage was their main concern. The Orthodox churches of Byzantium and the East, and later Muslim rulers, welcomed knowledge as we've seen in earlier episodes. There were ups and downs in the East, as we recorded, as when St. Cyril incited the Alexandrians to burn down their great library. Periodically, religious fundamentalists disrupted the balance of intellectual inquiry in the East and would eventually destroy the Byzantine Empire and much later the still enlightened Muslim empires and kingdoms. Of course, there is much more to this than the preceding tantalizing sentence. Enough for a whole new documentary, in fact. But on the whole, as we shall argue throughout our period, the West was left standing by the East until the later years of the 14th century. In Catholic Europe, science and philosophy would be seen by the church and secular rulers, the political nexus of society into the 17th century, as being potential enemies by questioning truths that had been inculcated into believers for centuries. Nicolaus Copernicus, the astronomer, was tortured by the Roman Inquisition in the 16th century to make him recant his revolutionary thesis that the earth revolved round the sun and not the other way about. Giordano Bruno was burned some years later for theorizing that the universe was endless and that the sun was not at its center. Galileo Galilei, another astronomer and one-time friend of a pope, lived under fairly unpleasant house arrest in Italy for his scientific opinions until his death in 1632. Only in 1992 did Pope John Paul II admit that Galileo had been right all along. I suppose it must have worked like this. If the Church could be wrong on matters as fundamental as the rising and the setting of the sun, what else could it be wrong about? The secular powers in the course of the 17th and 18th centuries enforced ancient religious injunctions less and less, partly because the evidence for a new view of our natural world and its place became overwhelming. Some religious folk in the West are still trying to stem a tide that has already flowed, especially in the United States and now in some British privately funded schools within the state system, with the invention about 25 years ago of intelligent design. After 2,000 years or more of creationism, some Christians have just discovered intelligent design. It may have occurred to you, as it has to me, that if intelligent design had any traction at all, then the blind spot in our eyes would have been long ago divinely corrected. It might alarm some viewers to know that 40% of Americans, apparently, believe in Armageddon, which could account for the fact that President George W. Bush's declaration of war on terror did not see him being collected by ambulance at the White House and consigned to a lunatic asylum. How can you make war on a metaphor? It was a declaration unlikely to have had any resonance on this side of the Atlantic had it been announced by a European leader, even Tony Blair, who fell in with it for reasons I still do not apprehend. While no one can doubt the Church's unique role as the only organized social services in Europe for centuries, protectors of the poor and the weak, keepers of the flame of a literate and artistic culture, the sheen of a more civilized life in Europe is also somewhat tarnished by religious introversion where intellectual inquiry is concerned. The Islamic experience, as I promised to recount, was different. We know that Christianity was never a monolithic culture, and by the 5th and 6th centuries it was riven by many differences in belief, rites and practices. Islam would also be divided against itself soon after the death of the Prophet. Within each faith, the different tensions would compete for domination. The people of the island of Britain would be crucial in the struggle for religious orthodoxy, and they were to become key players in imprinting the Roman form of Christianity into the hearts and minds of pagans in northwest Europe. Pope Gregory had intended to lead the first evangelical mission to Britain himself, but on being elevated to St. Peter's throne, this proved impossible. As we know, he sent Augustine of Canterbury and about 40 priests and monks who landed in Kent in 597. The party had travelled through Gaul, modern France, then a jigsaw of Frankish princes and independent noblemen. We do not know what Augustine's impressions of France were, but about 60 years later, Wilfrid, a future saint, made a similar trip back to England from Rome. Indeed, he made several such trips, on one occasion spending 3 years in Lyon. Wilfrid wrote much himself and was written about soon after his death and since, and we can infer something of his impressions of France. He admired the magnificence in which the Bishop of Lyon lived, and that prelate's adhesion to Roman doctrine. Wilfrid was also aware of the style of other Frankish religious leaders, and it's not unreasonable to suppose that Augustine, before him, had made his own observations, not necessarily the same as St. Wilfrid's. Both men, Augustine at Canterbury and Wilfrid at York, Ripon and Hexham, promoted Roman Catholicism, seeing conformity as essential to the spread of the word. As we've seen, Augustine was not successful at his convention with the errant bishops of the Britons in Wales, but Wilfrid was triumphant at the Synod of Whitby in 664, when, as we shall soon learn, original British, Irish or Celtic practices were officially discarded in England.
How the unwritten pact between papacy and nobility paid off is the next episode, when the popes became sovereign princes of Rome.